Welcome to this bonus episode of Let's Locums. What I'll be doing today is airing the entire uncut interview with Doug Wamsley. He was the inspiration for episode 9, The Worst Locum Tenens Experience in History, which I had a great time putting together. The meat of that podcast came from this interview, but I wanted to allow our listeners the opportunity to hear the whole thing because I think it's absolutely fascinating. And Mr. Wamsley also took some time to answer specific questions that I had, including the type of medical equipment and medicines that these docs had available, as well as the correlation with today's locum tenens doctors regarding short-term contracts and how those were utilized. I encourage you to check out Mr. Wamsley's books and articles. I'll link in the show notes. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Let's Locums, the podcast hosted by Drs. Mark and Allison Royer, ENT surgeons and the founders of SpecialtyLocums.com. Join us as we explore the world of locum tenens and help you navigate the options for a flexible and rewarding medical career. Hi, welcome to Let's Locums. My name is Mark Royer. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon and locum tenens physician. Our guest today, Douglas Wamsley, a retired attorney turned independent scholar with a passion for the history of 19th century Arctic exploration. Mr. Wamsley has rented extensively on the pioneers who ventured into the uncharted far northern regions, bringing their stories to life. He's the author of Polar Haze, a biography of Dr. Isaac Israel Hayes, and his latest work, Big Wolf, delves into the adventurous life of Frederick Schwatka, a soldier, explorer, and writer. It's an amazing book, by the way.
Thank you.
Today we will discuss one of the most adventurous and complicated locum tenens physicians in history, Dr. Octave Pavey, and his experience on what could be described as the worst locum tenens assignment in history. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I first had the opportunity to meet you electronically when I emailed you about an article you had written about this surgeon who got the smallest mention in a PBS documentary I had seen about something called the Greeley Expedition. And you emailed me back, which was amazing. And what caught my eye with this article was this specific fact that this doctor had worked what seemed like a short-term contract, almost like a locum tenens contract, which is an area of medicine that's growing, that specific type of practice. And it seemed like it turned out absolutely terribly. But what I would love to know is what kind of drew you to even write this article about this doctor?
Well, it's interesting. As I mentioned, untold stories are sort of my real interest. And anyone who's familiar with the Greeley expedition, which ended up in disaster, it's been told many times. In fact, most recently within the last couple of years, there's been a new book out about it. So the expedition itself is fascinating, largely because it ended up as a tragic tale of disaster and cannibalism, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But one of the maligned characters in that story was Dr. Octave Pavey. And he, as you'll see, didn't get along very well with his superior, Lieutenant Greeley. But I wondered whether there was a little more to Pavey than just this maligned doctor who was treated, at least he thought, very badly and was tried. His wife actually spent quite a number of years trying to redeem his character. And so it led me to look at his life prior to joining the expedition and sort of what was driving his personality that led him to this relationship conflict with Greeley. And it turned out to be actually a fascinating story in and of itself, not just as it relates to the Greeley expedition.
Let's talk about Dr. Pavey. So he was born in New Orleans, is that right?
That's right. So Pavey was born in New Orleans in 1844. His father had emigrated from France and had become a successful businessman. His mother was actually the daughter of a prominent Southern plantation family in antebellum South. So he came from a wealthy family. They could afford to send him abroad for European education and the so-called Grand Tour. He visited museums, rubbed shoulders with European artists, attended a prestigious Paris medical school where he received excellent medical training, which helped him through his career. But that privileged lifestyle and acceptance among European elite may have caused a sense of self-importance, at least in my opinion. But anyway, while he was in Paris, his attention turned to one subject, polar exploration. And as a number of people have said, it became monomaniacal about him. He was obsessed with polar exploration for his entire life, short as it was. But polar exploration was actually a fairly popular endeavor at the time. Motivated individuals, as well as nation states, others privately financed, were all competing to kind of fill in the blanks in the far north. And to discover the North Pole, that was kind of the holy grail of geography. And so that's what Pavey was looking at as he sat there in Paris and considered what he would do with his life. He was very fortunate when he was in Paris to meet a man by the name of Gustave Lambert, who was a French hydrographer. And the two planned an Arctic voyage for several years. But unfortunately, the plan came to nothing as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. And even more sadly, Lambert himself was killed in the war. So that put any end to any plans for that polar expedition on the part of Lambert and Pavey. But nonetheless, Pavey himself volunteered to serve with French loyalists in the Franco-Prussian War, even appointed himself captain. He certainly didn't lack confidence in his abilities, but his temperament would prove very ill-suited for subordinate roles. So after the war, he returned back to the U.S. and again attempted to raise another Arctic expedition. Spent quite a bit of time in San Francisco soliciting wealthy businessmen to get funding, but ultimately failed. And he was actually very fortunate that he failed in that endeavor because his plan was to actually raft on barrels to the North Pole from Bering Strait through what he believed would be an ice-free path to the North Pole. So a fairly fanciful objective. And as I said, he was very fortunate not to have made it. He did actually leave under cover of darkness because there were allegations that he'd actually fleeced some of his creditors. So again, a disappointment on his part. And so he traveled east. During that time, he was actually penniless for quite some period of time, was taken in by a physician in Kentucky, sort of raised himself, got him back on his feet, met his wife-to-be, Lila Mae Pavey. And so once he got his feet back on the ground again, he kind of made his way to Washington, D.C., where he met a very fascinating man by the name of Henry Howgate, who was a senior officer in the U.S. Signal Corps, part of the U.S. Army. At the time, the Signal Corps was really looking at improving communications, principally for the Army, of course, and they were establishing a system of telegraph poles across the frontier. But the Signal Corps was also looking at how to forecast weather. And their thought was that weather patterns in the Arctic had an effect on the lower 48 states. So Howgate's plan was to establish a so-called colony, kind of a permanent station at a location known as Lady Franklin Bay. Lady Franklin Bay is actually situated in northeastern Canada in the Canadian Arctic near the tip of Ellesmere Island. It's about 500 miles to the pole. It's about as close as you can get to the pole from land. From there, you jump onto the Arctic ice and you kind of float out to the North Pole. In any event, from their location at Lady Franklin Bay, on a clear day, you could actually see Greenland to the east across this narrow ice-filled channel, which will become an important part of the narrative. Pavey, fortunately, was selected to be a member of that party. He was originally a naturalist and physician. In 1880, the ship that Howgate purchased, which was called the Gulnare, and actually likely purchased that ship with money he had embezzled from the government in his position. In any event, the ship made it as far as Greenland with Pavey on board before it was deemed unfit for further travel. The commander of this kind of preliminary expedition was a man named Lieutenant Doane, who had actually made a name for himself in the West. He decided that he was going to return back to the United States because there was no way this ship was going to make its way to Lady Franklin Bay. However, Pavey decided he was going to stay in Greenland and make the best of the situation. He and a man by the name of Henry Clay, actually, nicknamed Harry. He was actually the grandson of the famous Kentucky statesman, which is kind of ironic. But Clay was literally a lawyer with no experience, but he had also become enamored with the Arctic, and with Pavey was going to stay in Greenland. After a long, bitter fight with Doan capitulated and left Pavey in Greenland. By the way, just to give you a little bit more background on Pavey's combative personality, while the transport ship, the Gulnair, was making its way north from Nova Scotia, Pavey, before Doan had actually joined the ship, was telegraphing Howgate demanding that he be appointed leader of the expedition. He also was contracting for some very expensive repairs to the ship, for which Doan was not particularly happy. So both Howgate and Doan were so incensed that they actually looked at hiring a replacement for Pavey while the ship was still in Nova Scotia. They brought the replacement on, he met Pavey, and Pavey so berated him that the man simply walked away, and Doan had no choice but to keep Pavey. And you'll see that it's something that repeats itself. Besides his bitter temper, obviously, Pavey was displaying this enormous unwillingness to accept orders and a huge tendency to overstep his authority. So Pavey and Clay remained in Greenland for a year, purposely living apart on opposite sides of this small island called Disco Island. Another remarkable story. The two of these men in this isolated area living separately for a year. The two had a bitter falling out when Clay claimed that Pavey had halted the medical treatment for a young boy. He was the son of one of the Danish administrators in Greenland. The boy was suffering from a fever and ultimately died. And Clay never forgave Pavey for what he considered this dishonorable conduct.
Well, that's fascinating. So I was going to ask, was Pavey practicing medicine throughout this whole course? I mean, he was over in San Francisco and then he made his way over into Kentucky. It sounds like in Kentucky he probably was. There was a physician he worked with there, but
yes.
I mean, was he practicing along the way?
I would say that prior to Kentucky, he was not practicing. He probably got an apprenticeship or considered an apprenticeship when he was in Kentucky. And when he was in Greenland, he did some modest medical work for which the administrator, not the fellow whose son had died, but the other administrator, Inspector Carup Smith, I believe was his name, was actually fairly gracious in what he said about Pavey, that he did actually help treat some of the people there with ailments, because in those areas of Greenland, there was very infrequently would they have a medical man, trained physician in the area. So my guess is that, well, actually more than a guess, Pavey did treat some ailments, including the son of the administrator who died, but probably some other things like colds, rheumatism, nothing serious that I was aware of, but he did provide some basic medical service there.
And the administrator's son who died, and that Clay was very upset with Pavey over, like, what was Clay alleging? Was he saying that he withheld treatment, that he gave the wrong treatment, or what was the
Clay
problem?
was claiming was that Pavey undertook to help the boy when he had the fever, and that this fever continued for quite some time. But during that period, the mother and father were completely distraught over it. And Pavey was actually as annoyed at the parents for how they were acting as they were for this boy who was kind of in agony. It was basically what Clay was saying was he just wanted to wash his hands of this whole situation and walked away from the poor boy. It wasn't as if he had concluded the boy was going to die. Or that there was nothing he could do for him. It was simply that he had become fed up with the situation and had walked away.
Oh, it's very tragic
situation, frankly.
Yeah, very sad.
And again, that was only Clay's opinion of the matter. I never really understood. Pavey never really mentioned it in his writings, and no, I have not read of any other accounts of it elsewhere. But no reason to doubt Clay.
Was Clay being the grandson of the Kentucky individual, is that how Pavey came into how they crossed paths, with Pavey spending time in Kentucky and meeting his wife there, or was this completely unrelated to that?
Actually, that's a very interesting point. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if the two had met and Clay had expressed a desire to visit the Arctic, and when the time came, Pavey had invited him. That actually makes quite a bit of sense now that you mention it. But up until now, I actually hadn't thought about it.
And then this is completely going down a rabbit hole, but did the American Civil War have any impact with regards to the timing of when Pavey was sent to Europe. Is that why he was relatively young when he went, I believe, right? He was born in
Yeah, so if
44
he
and
was born in 1940, it's funny you mention this because I had the same thought. He was born in 1944, would have been a US citizen, even though his father was probably born in France. So by the time of the Civil War, he would have been of age to have been drafted. And my guess is that, like a lot of people who had avenues available to them, Pavey's family sent him to Europe, or at least kept him in Europe during that time, because he probably would have gone to Europe before he was of age. But with the war raging, they probably left him there. And it was during the 60s that he was working on this expedition with Gustave Lambert, so he stayed on. But that was my sense as well, that there was a decided reason for maintaining him in Greenland.
and then how did his
I'm sorry, in Europe.
being from the South and having a mom who was from a plantation owning family, how did they fare? Do you have any idea? Like, is that why he
No,
was penniless?
yeah, that's a very interesting point. I always wondered how they managed. My guess is that they had their own residence separate from his mother's plantation upbringing. He was actually a successful cotton merchant. So my sense was they had their own residence, which was separate and probably wasn't run as a plantation. That was just the background of his mother.
Okay, interesting. All right, so he's on Greenland, separate from Clay on the same island, providing care for some patients at this time. And also, if I remember correctly from the article, he's kind of honing some of his Arctic skills. Is that right?
That's right. So while he was in Greenland, Pavey was actually very interested in learning how to survive in the Arctic. So he went on several long sledge journeys with another companion who obviously taught him the ropes, so to speak. But he did do a 700-mile sledge journey, became accomplished on his own, traveling by dog sled, did learn how to build snow huts, how to live in the Arctic, and actually learned a little bit of Inuktitut, Inuit language. So in that 1 year period, he actually did become a fairly accomplished Arctic traveler, much different than many of the men who joined the Greely expedition later, which we'll talk about in a moment. So as Pavey's learning the ropes out there in Greenland, the U.S. government is now approving an expedition, a big expedition to Lady Franklin Bay, the so-called Greely expedition, more associated with Greely than it is with Lady Franklin Bay. So the U.S. was one of 11 nations that were establishing scientific stations in various parts of the Arctic. The idea was to take scientific measurements simultaneously by these different nations. And the idea was also that rather than having these individual jumps at geographical discoveries, let's have a coordinated attempt to work and cooperate together. It was actually called the First International Polar Year, and a very logical thing to do, because up to that time, most of the attempts on the pole had been nation-based or individual-based.
So the idea was they were going to have these different stations set up, run by some different countries that they were recording all this meteorologic data at the same time. And then once they all got back together, they were going to analyze that and then kind of compare that to the data they had in, I guess, the lower 48 state, or 48 states
yeah,
at the time.
the idea was that once they collected this data, and in fairness to the Greely expedition, regardless of what had happened to it, they amassed a wealth of scientific information, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the idea was to look at that information collectively and see if you can distill patterns from it. Does the weather, get cooler over time as it goes from, A to B? Is magnetic pole different at different times? They were looking at things like everything from magnetic observations, temperature observations, tidal observations. So the idea was to pull that all together and see if they could distill some results from that.
Interesting. Okay. So the U.S. government has decided they're going to do this, and Pavey's on Greenland.
U.S. government decides they're going to be part of this. They actually had one of the little lesser known facts of the first polar year was that the U.S. actually had 2 stations in the Arctic. One was in Point Barrow, which performed exactly as they were expected to. They maintained their period of time. They kept their measurements. Nobody died. no serious incidents, and it sort of without fanfare did its job. Unlike the Greely expedition, which has spawned all sorts of interest. So the Greely expedition was led by none other than Adolphus W. Greely and was manned by largely 25 soldiers, mainly volunteers from frontier posts in the Dakotas and Montana territories. Again, the idea being that these soldiers who are out on these frontier posts are used to an Arctic climate. It didn't quite fit Arctic travel and all the things that are required for an Arctic expedition, but at least they're used to cold weather and maybe some dark winters. This year, a more rugged ship was going to take them up north called the Proteus that could handle the ice. The ship was going to stop in Greenland, pick up pavy and clay, and some additional supplies and dogs, and then steam north to Lady Franklin Bay. So they get to Greenland. Greely meets Pavey. By the way, Greely has only personal acquaintance with one member of the expedition, Frederick Kislingbury, second in command. So every other person on this expedition, Greely has never met, including Pavey.
How was Pavey on their radar? I mean, how did they know that he's hanging out in Greenland, has this Arctic experience, is physician naturalist?
What happened was the connection was Howgate. So Howgate, who had initiated that first expedition and really had the idea for a colony at Lady Franklin Bay, was the individual who tied the two together and said, okay, look, we still have these two men in Greenland. They were originally going to go to Lady Franklin Bay. Now that we're setting up another expedition that's going to go up into the high Arctic and take observations, we should probably leverage what we've done with Pavey and Clay over there in Greenland, pick them up, and let's really finish what we originally intended to do.
Did Howgate have any financial incentive on this expedition at all? Was he it was a government issue?
No,
so wasn't he an investor?
So the fascinating piece of this picture is that, as I mentioned before, Howgate, it's believed that a large portion of the money used to purchase the Gulnair, the ship that took Pavey and Clay up to Greenland, was used from embezzled funds. By the time the Greely expedition had left, that actually was confirmed, that in his role in the Signal Corps, he was actually embezzling large sums of money. So Howgate flees Washington, D.C. The Pinkerton detectives are sent after him. And it's only years later that they find Howgate working as an antiquarian book dealer in New York City. And he's ultimately arrested.
Story.
Yeah. The infamous Henry Howgate. It's that remarkable story of what becomes a remarkable expedition in and of. So Howgate is out of the picture, which is one of the reasons I believe Greely didn't really understand what was going on with Pavey and that he was this difficult personality. So in any event, Pavey meets Greely and signs on as a contracted physician. His title is acting assistant surgeon. And just a little background on contract physicians at the time. So from the end of the Civil War, the U.S. military had undergone severe downsizing in officers, enlisted men, and even the medical service. In the Army, there were medical officers who held commissions, just like line officers. Obviously, not that many. These medical officers had passed an examination before an Army medical board to gain their commissions, and they were generally well qualified. They received commissions equal in rank to first lieutenants, and they could rise to the equivalent of a captain after 3 to 5 years of good service, and then thereafter possibly major or even colonel. However, in light of the severely understaffed medical corps in the frontier, the Army also contracted with private physicians, civilians, who generally served for various terms. Those terms could be as short as weeks or months. More typically, they ran year to year. Of course, those contract physicians varied in their abilities, but some were actually quite qualified and at times worked well with commissioned officers. At other times, unfortunately, they were treated badly in terms of assignments. The commissioned officers taking the better assignments at the post, the contract physicians sent out to, some of these outlying areas, and they were actually looked down upon by commissioned medical officers at times. Not everyone was that status conscious, but there were certainly some in the medical corps.
Any idea what their pay was like compared to? I mean, this is really digging in deep, but their pay of a contracted physician for the military as opposed to a commissioned officer?
It's a very good question. My guess is it's probably less. So commissioned medical officers were paid presumably on the same scale as commissioned line officers. I don't know what contract physicians were paid. My guess is it was certainly less. But for many of them, it was really a means of getting by. That it was difficult in some of these Western areas to support themselves as a physician. A lot of their patients couldn't pay for services. It reminds me of Gunsmoke with Doc. He's taking care of these patients for free. And I suspect that was very true of a lot of these physicians, particularly in the West. So they were happy to have at least what appeared to be a stable situation that provided for regular pay.
Great. So it was definitely more difficult to become if we're talking from a status standpoint, the commissioned medical officer was the more difficult job to obtain. It was the one that would be more highly sought after. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely true.
Okay.
Commissioned medical officers did pass a fairly rigorous examination. They were held to a higher standard. So that was the more sought after position if you were, a physician.
So this idea of the military having this Arctic expedition and feeling like they needed to hire an assistant surgeon for a contract role was fairly common in this time, it sounds like.
Yes. Particularly there weren't that many polar expeditions, but in the Western frontier, I seem to recall having read that the number of commissioned medical officers post-Civil War was in the neighborhood of, 150 or so, vastly undermanned for what they needed to do, which was staff, a number of posts in the far West, particularly as things heated up in the 1870s following the Custer disaster. So contract physicians were very common at the time and through, I believe, the
How long was Pavi's contract for?
Pavy's contract was a 1-year contract. So Another kind of interesting thing was, which we'll talk about a little more in a moment, was that the expedition, once they reached Lady Franklin Bay, was expected to stay there for at least 1 year. So the transport ship would drop them off with the supplies at what was known as Fort Conger. And the relief ship was to return a year later with additional supplies, take off any members of the expedition who may have been ill or wanted to go home. So it made sense to have at least a 1-year contract from Pavy, which they could renew, the following year. So that at least was the idea and concept. They were very lucky that year that the Proteus, the transport ship, was able to navigate the ice of what's known as Kennedy Channel and drop off the members of the expedition and their supplies, including Pavy, at Lady Franklin Bay. It was a very unusual set of circumstances that were very favorable, which, as we'll see, wasn't the case in later years. And the idea was that if the relief ship didn't get there after the first year, it would get there at the summer of the second year. And if it hadn't arrived by that second year, Greeley was ordered to make his way south to hopefully relief, where there were supposedly some rations left for him if the relief ship couldn't make it all the way up to Lady Franklin Bay.
And one thing I found really fascinating as I've looked into the kind of this Arctic time is they have all these contingencies that they plan for. So it's like, okay, well, plan A is they're going to come pick you up next year. Plan B is you have enough rations to last another year. And then plan C is, okay, well, you're going to have to, something's going on. You're going to have to head to this other alternative point where we may or may not have additional supply. I found that fascinating. That seems to be true against, any other books of yours that I've read or in any of these documentaries that I've seen is you can't communicate. You don't really know what the hell's going on. You just have to kind of count on the protocol and contingency plans.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, particularly with a military expedition where following orders is imperative. There were these kind of plan A, plan B, plan C. But as you know, the situation in the Arctic can vary day to day, year to year, as the case of the Greeley expedition. So there needs to be some flexibility, I think, in the mind of the commander to account for some of these things that may not go exactly as planned, as we'll see. So in any event, before the transport ship, which has now dropped off Greeley and Pavey and the men, has left, there's this first breakdown between Greeley and Pavey. So remember, Greeley's this career Army officer, veteran of the Civil War, considered a New England Puritan, who had made a name for himself in these various organizational tasks, like building telegraph systems across the frontier. A stickler for rigid adherence to orders and to discipline, which, one might add, almost led to his downfall. Smart man, but perhaps lacking in some interpersonal or social skills necessary to command men on a polar expedition. I remember one of the members of the expedition claimed early on that what Greeley didn't understand was that managing a group of troops against an enemy was different than managing an Arctic expedition. In any event, the relationship between Greeley and Pavey was doomed from the start. Pavey precipitated that first disagreement. Pavey delivers an ultimatum to Greeley that if Clay isn't sent home, Pavey would leave. The transport ship has not left yet. Greeley's outraged. He's up here, northern Greenland. He's got no choice because Pavey's the only physician within 1,000 miles, and subordinates don't dictate orders to their commander. However, Greeley needs this physician, and he buckles under to Pavey's demand. In fact, he went so far because he didn't want to admit that Pavey had issued this demand, says to Clay, "You're going to have to go home, but I want you to tell everybody that it was your decision and you want to go home." So Clay gets up there, much against his own feelings, says, "I want to go home." In any event, it was the start of an awkward arrangement at best. By the way, yeah.
How far in would this have been after they first met? So they've got picked up in Greenland and then they took the Proteus up. Yes. And then they're coming back. Okay.
So they meet in July or end of June in Greenland. They're dropped off in early to mid-August. So they've known each other about a month. But to that point, there's been no misunderstanding. Pavey signed his contract freely. Didn't appear that there was any sort of friction before they get to Greenland. Why Pavey didn't raise the issue of sending Clay home while they were in Greenland is another issue. Not that Greeley would have had any ability to do anything while in Greenland either. Mm-hmm. The other interesting point was, at the time they're taking off the supplies from the ship, another man, Lieutenant Frederick Kislingbury, this is the second in command, the man selected by Greeley. As I mentioned, the only man that Greeley is personally acquainted with before the expedition started, he resigns. He says, "I want to go home." Kislingbury claims that Greeley has refused to listen to any of his opinions or his advice, and that basically he was ignored. They had an argument over whether Kislingbury needed to breakfast at the same time as the enlisted men, and he resigns. Unfortunately, his resignation comes a few minutes too late. He gathers his belongings, runs after the departing ship. It's literally steaming away in the ice, and no one sees him on board the ship, and he's left standing there literally holding his bags.
Awkward walk back to camp?
Humiliated. So humiliated, he returns back to Fort Conger. Despite the situation, separated from the outside world for at least a year, Greeley never offers Kislingbury an opportunity to rejoin the expedition, and Kislingbury, feeling mistreated, never offers to rejoin. So awkwardly, he's in this state of purgatory as an outsider, awaiting the release ship, but with no official duties on the expedition. I did want to add the point we made before, which is we're now in in Ellesmere Island, and Pavey, they have picked up two Greenlanders when they were in Greenland, two native Greenlanders who did have some hunting and Arctic skills. So besides Pavey, there was these two other men who actually performed extremely well for the expedition. They were expert hunters and expert dog sledge drivers. And so Greeley was very fortunate to pick them up in addition to having Pavey. Greeley now recognizes that Pavey is one of the only members of the expedition who has this practical experience, and in fact says, "Okay, I know you're my physician, but I know you really want to do some Arctic travel. Take some sled dogs and go scout out a route to the northern tip of Ellesmere Island. And we'll see if you can find the best route for the summer trips when we're trying to reach the North Pole. Another aside, this is the first international polar expedition. So I always thought it was interesting that Greeley made no secret that his strong desire was to reach the farthest north. Farthest north meaning the highest northern latitude ever attained by man. So the North Pole obviously would be the highest, but to that point, there had been steps taken by different expeditions leading up to this highest north. And in fact, in 1875-76, the British Arctic expedition, which had actually wintered at one of the ships had wintered at Lady Franklin Bay, had led a sledge expedition, which had achieved the farthest north at that time. Greeley was hell-bent on besting that British expedition. In any event, Greeley does permit Pavey to take that first sledge trip to the tip of Ellesmere Island. On the return trip, Pavey's companion, a man named George Rice, a civilian actually who joined the expedition as photographer, breaks down completely from rheumatism. Pavey carries his load for miles and finally pushes on ahead solo for help. In another trip, Pavey, with another companion named William Whistler, private U.S. Army, comes up with this crazed plan that he shares with Whistler. Pavey asks Whistler to help steal Greeley's dogs and make a dash for the pole. Whistler, being a dutiful military man, declines the solicitation, but Pavey becomes so abusive that Whistler claimed he had to draw his revolver to actually settle the agitated Pavey.
Holy cow. So this is while they're out doing one of these scouting trips.
Yes.
He has Whistler.
Yes.
So
yeah.
So these scouting trips, this is something that Pavey would want to be doing, right? Like this is a huge interest of his, even though he's there to be a physician and a naturalist, I think. Is that part of his role?
Yes.
Collecting specimens, documenting specimens, drawing specimens, perhaps, and then caring for the men with his physician skills. Is that all accurate? And so then these kind of scouting trips with the sled dogs is something that is of an interest of his and something that he's wanting to be doing.
He's obsessed with making a name for himself in the far north. Unfortunately for him, as the naturalist and physician, he's not going to have the primary role of making the attempt for the farthest north. And I should have said that before I mentioned the Whistler situation, because Pavey understands that he's not going to be the guy that they pick to lead this sled team for the farthest north. He may participate with some supply runs supporting that expedition, but he's not getting it. So I guess he figures, look, the only way I'm going to do this is if I commandeer somebody to help me steal some dogs and make this crazy run, which unlikely that it would ever have happened anyway. But it shows you, his mindset in terms of what happened. He was, in fact, a naturalist and did collect the natural history specimens, many of which were brought in by other hunters. But his responsibility was to actually catalog this list of natural history specimens, in addition to being the physician. And in fact, during the first winter, Pavey has to undertake his most difficult task, which is the treatment of the badly broken leg for Sergeant Hampton Gardner. Gardner was traveling over to make some scientific observations, slipped down an embankment and fractured his lower leg very badly. But to his credit, Pavey set the break. The fracture healed in over several months. More importantly, though, Pavey was a stickler about their diet. He had learned from that British expedition that had wintered 7-8 years before in Lady Franklin Bay that they had suffered badly from scurvy. That expedition lacked a diet adequate in vitamin C. Pavey didn't know vitamin C was the means to prevent scurvy, but he had read enough to know that a diet rich in fresh meat would keep it at bay. And so the Greeley expedition shot more than 100 muskoxen during their stay at Fort Conger. That may actually sound like a lot of muskoxen, and it is for 25 men. Later expeditions under Robert Peary and Donald McMillan would kill more than 600 muskoxen and actually negatively affect the size of the Ellesmere Island herd. This is kind of an aside there. But in any event, Pavey methodically checks the men's gums and the overall condition to maintain their health. Through the first winter, not one man suffers from scurvy, which is actually very commendable.
So he's doing, from the physician side of things, were there any complaints at this point? I mean, he was able to successfully set this leg, the patient survived. He's making sure their diet is maintained so they don't get scurvy. Was there any, other than his personality up to this point in that first year, is there any documentation that people were just not happy with the quality of physician care he was providing?
Not at all. In fact, this kind of takes us a step further. Pavey got along very well with his peers, and to a man, including Greeley, admitted that he performed his medical services extraordinarily well. It's one of the marked contrasts of Pavey, which is he was an excellent medical man, provided exactly what he was taken on board this expedition to do, but on the other hand, couldn't get along with his superiors. And was ill-tempered, combative, but among the men, he was actually well liked, and a number of them offered testimonials about, how well they were treated, not only medically, but just in terms on a personal level by Pavey. So it's an interesting, fascinating man from a personality point of view. As an aside, I quickly looked at what medicines Pavey may have had with him during this Arctic expedition. I didn't find much, but I did find one document that he had written that said that when he was requesting medicines to take, what he said was, I found the following items indispensable. The first one he lists is cod liver oil, evidently a cure-all for all sorts of ailments, even at that time. The second item that he lists is digitalis. And then the three other remedies he mentions are all herbal remedies, at least as far as I can tell. Nux vomica, which is actually considered a poison, Veratrum viride, and Hyoscyamus. So those were the ones that Pavey felt were instrumental to a physician on an Arctic expedition.
For some reason, I have to look, I have no idea what those herbals are. I had assumed there's a lot of cocaine and morphine at that time.
Yeah, they probably carried laudanum, which was an opium derivative for pain. And also that was another cure-all. And I recall this from my Schwatka experience. That was a cure-all for everything from stomach ailments to menstrual issues to all sorts of pain causes.
Yeah, I was Ulysses S. Grant, and I guess it probably would have been around this time, post-Civil War, when he had head and neck cancer, right? That's our area of our specific specialization area. He was trying to get this book sold, his biography, and I remember reading about how he was using cocaine that's what his doctors were giving him, right? To help with the bleeding, to help with the swelling, to help with the pain. It was just kind of nonstop in those last 3 months. But yeah, cocaine and morphine, stimulants and opioids seem to be a go-to back then. So I'm wondering if some of those herbals are
and obviously in many instances led to addiction and a number of other problems.
Fascinating that you're able to find that document.
Yeah,
so that's one thing. As a total aside, one thing I really like that you're kind of reading about how you write history and how you study history that was completely unknown to me, that I hadn't seen before, but was the fact you're able to dig into these original documents. They just shed so much light on even something like that, to see what someone wrote and said that, this is what I needed for it just provides so much context, and it's just very fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things I enjoy most, is kind of finding the primary source materials and kind of bringing to life, in many cases, it's just pieces of a bigger puzzle. For example, one of the items I found was Mrs. Pavey's diary while she was in Washington and they were preparing for the first Howgate expedition. And you could see that she helped advance his career by becoming friendly with both Howgate and Greeley's wife. She was an English teacher, so when the expedition left and ran into problems when they hadn't returned, she was writing, lobbying people. When Pavey was about to quit on that first expedition to Greenland, she wrote him a long letter saying, stick it out, because if you quit now, you'll never get another chance. So it's very interesting to see how these other primary pieces fit into the bigger puzzle. Anyway, back to the Greeley expedition. So they passed the first winter. in good health. Following summer, they did actually achieve this farthest north, the highest northern latitude ever attained. They were still short of the North Pole, and they exceeded by merely 4 miles the farthest north of that British Arctic expedition of 75-76, which to his death, Greely believed that was his greatest accomplishment. So a second winter passes, and Pavey's becoming very uneasy about their chances. He starts to urge Greely to make plans for a southern retreat. And at this point, there's no end to Greely's fault finding with Pavey. He's not listening to a word Pavey's saying, except perhaps his medical advice. But Pavey's medical advice at this point was, let's not do any sledge journeys because we know that this drains the men, contributes to scurvy, and we really need to marshal our resources here because we're going to have to make this trip south if the relief ship doesn't come. Greely, of course, doesn't listen to him, sends the men off on a couple expeditions, not as lengthy as the farthest north trip, but they're still doing some interesting sledge journeys. I mean, Greely's party did make some very important geographical discoveries. They discovered Lake Hazen in the interior of Ellesmere Island, and a number of other sledge journeys, contributed to the geography of Ellesmere Island. But at this point, Greely's had enough of Pavey. Pavey was not very particular about paperwork, so he was failing to keep adequate medical reports. Oddly, though, he's caring well for the men, but wasn't completing these reports, but that was important to Greely. He was also failing to catalog the list of natural history specimens they had collected, so Greely gave that to somebody else. Basically, the two were barely talking to each other at this point. So in July, we have this interesting situation that Pavey's contract is now coming up for renewal. And this time he says, I'm not signing, my contract, but I will continue to take care of the members of the expedition.
Was Greely going to offer him one? Was he even going to be offered a renewal?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think from Greely's point of view, his opinion was, I need a physician, and, military orders dictate I need to contract this person for another year. So, yeah, even though it was a formality, Greely was insisting on, signing this contract. So then Greely orders Pavey to turn over his diary, probably the last thing that Pavey wants him to see. Pavey refuses. Greely then places him under house arrest.
Wow.
Recognizing the absurdity of the situation, he releases him, lets him continue providing his medical service. So the relief ship fails to reach them the second year. Greely now is going to abandon their safe haven at Fort Conger and retreat several hundred miles south to what he believed was a substantial stockpile of rations left for him on the southern Ellesmere Island coast that would sustain them through the winter until the relief expedition could pick them up further south without having to deal with the ice. So little did they know that the first relief expedition was hung up pretty far south, left no rations. The second year, fared even worse. The ship was crushed in the ice and managed to leave 2 weeks' worth of rations at Cape Sabine, which is where Greely's party was retreating to. So Greely's taking a huge gamble on his part that they're going to find this stockpile of provisions if they make their way south. So they man several boats, a steam launch for traveling through one of the most ice-choked channels in the Arctic. They carry 30 days worth of food, thinking that with the rations he's going to get at the other end, or pick up along the way, if the Nair's British expedition has left some rations, they'll have more than enough. The trip was a disaster. They're fighting through these ice floes in small boats. They slowly make their way south, thinking they're going to get picked up by a relief expedition. As a landsman, Greely was completely out of his element. They're navigating ice-strewn channel with shifting tides, swirling currents, and ice flows that were well beyond his navigation skills. At times, they're drifting east towards Greenland. At other times, they're drifting west towards Ellesmere Island. Greely's losing his patience by the moment, maybe his mind. He starts giving contradicting orders, scolding, swearing at the men. And to their credit, they grumbled, but they did their best. When he wasn't in his sleeping bag shouting orders, according to some of the members, he would prance around on deck with his dress sword and his holstered gun. A couple times he got pitched overboard with the heaving seas, as most of the men were. So after this frustrating, slow retreat, 2 weeks, 100 miles, well short of where they're trying to get to. The men uniformly believed their best course of action would be to return to Fort Conger, where they could sit it out for another winter in the safety of this comfortable station. Greeley is unrelenting, and order is an order. At one point, in the midst of the ice floes, Greeley even suggested abandoning the boats and floating on the ice floes to Greenland. Sergeant Brainerd writes in his diary that the idea was simply madness. Pavey, in a bit of morbid humor, writes that it was like a nightmare out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. Things got so bad that Brainerd claims he was approached by Pavey with a plan to mutiny. Pavey would declare Greeley insane and appoint the second in command to lead them back to Fort Conger. It was, by the way, the leading them back to Fort Conger was probably not crazy. Brainerd was the only officer at that point who had actually commanded some respect by the men, and Pavey knew that if Brainerd went along with it, the other men would likely follow. But Brainerd ignored the demand, and it came to nothing, so he claimed. Brainerd also refused to tell Greeley, which would have been a dereliction of his duty as an officer, because he knew that Greeley might overreact and actually take to the floes and try to go to Greenland. Brainerd actually admitted years later that had the plan been successful, their fate may have been very different. It's an interesting revelation by Brainerd. So the expedition finally reaches what they called Camp Clay on Cape Sabine in October, 52 days after their start. By the way, Camp Clay is named after Harry Clay, their absent expedition member, which probably irked Pavey to no end. Cape Sabine is a barren, rocky promontory on the Ellesmere Island coast. And to this point, they've used virtually all their rations. And at this time of year, game is exceedingly scarce. So the men huddled under the overturned boats for shelter. Their stay at Cape Clay became tragic. Over the course of nearly 9 months, through a dark, cold winter, huddled together to share body heat, 18 members slowly died of starvation. One member actually drowned while he was hunting. Not surprisingly, allegations of food thefts begin to rise. Among the more egregious acts was Pavey's theft of food from Corporal Joseph Ellison, an invalid who had lost both his hands and feet to frostbite and was entirely dependent upon Pavey for his care. At this point, Greeley completely chose to ignore the misconduct of his physician. How they managed to survive as long as they did is remarkable. Fortuitously, they discovered small shrimps, actually flea shrimps is what they're called, about the size of a corn kettle, that they could catch with their nets. In the last few months at Cape Sabine, most of their food consisted of these shrimps, but it still wasn't enough to satisfy their caloric needs. The men slowly died one by one. First, they simply covered them with stones. Later, they were just hauled outside the boats. Several bodies washed away. Oddly, in the midst of this misery, Pavey circulates a testimonial asking the men to attest to his medical skills. To your point, what did they think? 13 of the men signed the testimonial praising his skills. Greeley, of course, was not one of them. And another interesting fact, as I mentioned before, is the men uniformly had positive things to say about their relationship with Pavey and his medical treatment. It was only Pavey's superiors that seemed to have an issue with him, and perhaps Clay. So,
wow. Okay. That's insane. These people, so they moved, they headed down to where there were supposed to be rations, and there were no rations there. Right? Did they make it to that point? That Cape Sabine? That was the plan, right?
Yes, they made it to Cape Sabine. Yep, and that's where they set up their winter quarters.
So they're huddling under boats. There's no food. They ran out of the rations they brought. They've burned through that. There's little shrimps, but there's no fish or no actual game to hunt, and they're just starving to death. And what at this point, Pavey? So he was obviously his party is dying. They're dying left and right. And what is he concerned? What is he thinking here to have this testimonial? Is he concerned he's going to get ultimately, is he worried about his reputation if he doesn't make it off? Is he worried about actually being imprisoned for poor care? What an interesting thing to be sending around. Asking people to say, hey, get a letter of recommendation from your patients in the midst of this horrendous situation.
I think that's the nature of his personality. I think at that point, he probably knew that they were likely doomed and that his legacy would be that, notwithstanding the fact that we had to go through this horrific situation, Pavey did his best. It was very similar to when he left Greenland. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I think I did. The inspector in Greenland wrote him a very strong letter of recommendation saying that Greeley did a fine job when he was in Greenland. And I think the same thing carried over here. I think it was just the nature of this kind of self-centered personality that said, look, I did a good job. I want you guys to attest to it and, sign this paper to demonstrate that. As you said, very unusual given the circumstances.
The other thing that's interesting about him is a lot of the people that I have interacted with who have that same like that confidence and that feeling like they should be leading it. They don't get along well with authority. They also don't really feel to have that sense that they need affirmation from others, right? So that's what I find interesting about him is the fact that while he has this confidence, some would say overconfidence, he has these things that he feels that he's very good at, including his medical care. He also feels like he has to have it in writing, these recommendations. And I don't know if that is something that was just done at the time to get these letters, but I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it was typically done at the time, particularly given the circumstances, the dire nature of the situation. No doubt, to your point, Pavey believed that he was far superior to Greeley, and really, Greeley was not competent to be the leader of this expedition. I really should be, and I can travel better in the Arctic. I can live better. I know how to drive dogs, and this guy is really incompetent. No doubt about that he did have this superiority complex. As to why he pushed for this testimonial. To your point, I'm not exactly sure why, other than that there was something about his personality that wanted this affirmation, even though he internally felt he was superior to Greeley. One of those unanswered questions.
Is there any, at this time, is there any writing or diary or any kind of original source where we knew where Pavey was at as far as, did he think he was going to make it out alive? Did he think it was going to just be a few months? Any idea what he was thinking at this moment when he's sending the testimonial around as far as his ultimate outcome?
I think that at this time, January, February comes. The rescue actually comes in June, which we'll get to in a moment. But by March, April, they're in very bad straits. And I think that by then, they all had a strong suspicion they weren't going to be saved. Greeley has already written his last will and testament, which is attested to by Brainerd and two or three others. As the men were dying, and there were a handful of them left, including Pavey, who didn't die until close to the end, sadly, I think they all believed that they weren't going to make it. Things were so bad at that point. Men were dropping pretty quickly. And as I said, Pavey was one of the last to die. So I think, as I said, they all thought it was just a matter of time before they died. I did want to make mention another point, which is, Greeley sort of passed over Pavey's theft of food, but one member was actually ordered shot by Greeley for stealing food. His name was Private Henry. He was actually spotted stealing food on one occasion. He denied the act, but he involuntarily vomited the bacon from his shrunken stomach, which gave him away. He was warned and then later spotted stealing food again. As he was one of the strongest men, Greeley secretly gave the order for 3 men to shoot him when he was unawares. They approached him from behind, gave him little warning, and shot him. So again, you have this kind of inconsistency of, how come you shot this man for stealing food, but you didn't do the other guy? He was more important because he was the physician. Oddly, Pavey dies the same day. According to Greeley, his death was caused by a self-administered dose of a poisonous medicine. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Too weak to dig a grave, his body washed out to sea.
So this is actually a question I had for you when I corresponded to you about that article. It was the same day as this food stealer was shot in the back by 3 people, ordered by Greeley. Their physician dies the same day, and the reason for that was given by Greeley as a self-administered dose of a poison, essentially. And I was like, do you believe that? Was this, and was he actually killed intentionally by Greeley And can you tell me what your thoughts are on that?
I wasn't there, so it's hard to speculate. But I don't believe Greeley killed him. I think at that point they were all in such bad shape; it was not at all surprising and just coincidental that Pavey died when he did. I also don't believe he died from a self-administered poison. I think he probably just died of starvation, like most of the other ones did. But again, that's speculation. They were ultimately saved. Some of them, a relief expedition finally reached them in June, commanded by Winfield Scott Schley. At that point, there were only 7 men still alive. That included Greeley. Most of those 7 were huddled in a collapsed tent, barely alive. It's been said that they had perhaps days to live if Schley hadn't arrived when he did. One of those 7 is another sad story. One of those 7 who survived was Corporal Ellison, and the man without hands and feet, and he actually died on the ship home. So only 6 made it back. And then, interestingly, these 6 were feted as heroes by the military as they tried to salvage what was an absolute disaster. There was a large welcome held in Portsmouth with the Atlantic Fleet. Thousands lined the shores to see the survivors. Greeley was hailed as the savior. Quickly, though, reports from the rescuers made their way to the press, which was happy to run with the story. The men at Camp Clay had engaged in cannibalism to survive. Greeley, is asked about it, initially denies the reports, as does Schley, who was there. However, the body of Frederick Kislingbury, one of the few that was actually brought back, had been sent home in a sealed metal casket, bolted shut with 50 bolts. Very unusual. The military claimed it was for public health reasons. Other people might think it was because they didn't want it open. So Kislingbury receives a huge funeral in his hometown of Rochester. His body is buried, and several days later, his brother has it exhumed. And when they look at the body, the signs of cut marks by sharp instruments were unmistakable. Of course, the press had a field day. Competing headlines were they cannibals, eating dead comrades, craving for his blood? Greeley was forced to acknowledge that if there was cannibalism, he didn't know anything about it. And over time, the story finally subsides. And, the end of the Lady Franklin Bay situation was it didn't hurt Greeley very much, despite what you might think of his leadership on the expedition. 2 years after the return, he's promoted from captain to brigadier general, a huge step. The Kislingbury family, the Pavey families were strong objectors, not surprisingly, but ignored. He lived until the ripe old age of 91, dying in 1935.
Oh, geez.
Incredible. Wow. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service. So it ended up well for Greeley in any event.
Jeez. What a story. Fascinating. So, well, thank you so much for sharing that. So I do have one question. So Pavey, his journal, how would that have made it back? Would that have been in his area where he died, and then the rescuers would have grabbed that and brought that document back?
So Schley was under orders to confiscate the diaries, which he did, and they were brought back to the offices of the Signal Corps, and where they were held for months and months. Kislingbury's family, for example, was clamoring to have their diary returned to them, and they were ultimately returned. Interestingly, the Signal Corps made transcripts of the surviving diaries that survived. They maintained transcripts of all the diaries from the point at which they left Fort Conger until the rescue. So if you go to the National Archives, you'll see that there are 8 or 10 diaries. Greeley's diary, since he continued on in the military, is there in full, and Brainerd's diary is there in full. But for the other members who had their diaries returned to them, the retreat and stay at Camp Sabine are still recorded in the National Archives.
Fascinating. I'm curious about your take. I know your background is in law and then history, and so not necessarily in medicine, but I'm curious to know your perspective regarding this question. Are there any lessons to be learned from Dr. Pavey that you think can be applied for today's physicians?
I think what I would say is Pavey did receive a very good education and put that medical education to good use. The thing that sort of set him apart from, I really can't compare him to a lot of other medical men at the time, but I do think he was extremely well read. And that was, if you look at his diary, he mentioned, narrative after narrative that he had read about Arctic expeditions. He was fully prepared to understand what and members of an Arctic expedition would have contended with over particularly a long, dark winter. And he understood the need for fresh diet, a food of fresh diet. Not everyone did, even as late as the 1870s, for example, that British expedition suffered badly from scurvy. In part because they lacked a fresh meat diet. So I think, to his credit, being well educated, well read, gave him the ability to address the medical issues that he was expected to deal with as a physician.
Excellent. That's really fascinating. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Wamsley.
Great. I should leave you with one note. Coincidentally, your timing with the Pavey article comes as I'm finishing a biography of Frederick Kislingbury. So,
second in command.
Second in command.
Yeah.
So you were fascinated by Frederick Schwatka, who had sort of this unheralded experience in the U.S. military. Well, before Kislingbury signed on to the Greeley expedition, he had spent 10 years on the Western frontier. He became a leader of Indian scouts and was highly well regarded for his Indian language skills, working with native peoples, and was even at the senior levels. General Terry was commending him. And so this fellow who, left the frontier to join Greeley's expedition, and it became kind of an outcast after he joined, had this marvelous career before he joined. So actually it will, of course, go through the Greeley expedition as it relates to Kislingbury's involvement, but it also was intended really to pick up his Western frontier experience.
Oh, awesome. Excellent. Well,
Not
I can't
a doctor,
wait.
But nonetheless. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, hey, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It was a
you're
pleasure to
welcome.
meet you and chat with
I hope
you.
it went okay.
Oh, it went great. Are you kidding me? This is so fascinating. So good. It was everything I was hoped it could be and more. So this was awesome. So thank you so much.
All
And
right, well, thank you.
We'll put it together, and I'll make sure you get a copy there before we publish it.
Send me a link.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye, Mark.
Bye. You have been listening to Let's Locums, a podcast brought to you by SpecialtyLocums.com and hosted by Drs. Mark and Allison Royer. SpecialtyLocums.com is a physician-run locum tenens company. We're dedicated to providing the best locum tenens opportunities for our amazing healthcare providers. Join us every week as we dive deep into the world of locum tenens.